It's weird how you can build an entire life as a fortress. Mine has walls of paper, mortar made of ink, and ramparts fortified by verifiable facts. I'm a historian, not the dusty, tweed-wearing kind you see in movies, but the kind that gets her hands dirty, sifting through the tangible remnants of the past. I spend my days in archives, the air thick with the scent of decaying paper and leather, tracing the lives of people through the things they left behind. Letters, diaries, tax records, wills. There is a profound comfort in it, a beautiful, simple logic. A thing either happened or it didn't. A person was either here or they weren't. You can hold the proof in your hands, feel the weight of it, see the faded script with your own eyes. There are no ghosts in the archives, no whispering spirits in the margins of a 17th century ledger. There is only what remains, solid and real. This is the world I chose, or rather, the world I fled to. My mother lived in a different world entirely. Hers was a place teeming with unseen forces, a chaotic, terrifying carnival of spirits, omens, and psychic premonitions. Our house wasn't a home. It was a revolving door for tarot readers with smudged eyeliner, palmists who smelled of incense and desperation, and mediums who claimed to speak with my dead relatives. I'd come home from school to find strangers in a trance at our kitchen table, their eyes rolled back in their heads, channeling messages from my great-aunt Mildred about a misplaced brooch. My mother would hang on every word, her face a mask of rapturous belief. To her, these whispers from beyond were more real than the bills piling up on the counter, more important than the parent-teacher conference she'd forgotten about. She saw it as a gift, this connection to the other side. I saw it as a sickness, a willing surrender of reason to fear. The absolute peak of her delusion, the moment that shattered my childhood and forged the woman I am today, came on a sweltering August night when I was 10. She'd been in a state for weeks, convinced the ghost of her grandmother was haunting the house. That night, she burst into my room, her eyes wide with a terror that felt chillingly authentic. "She's here, Lena. Great-grandma. She says she have to leave, now. There's danger." I remember the smell of smoke, faint at first, like a neighbor's barbecue. But my mother wasn't looking for a source. She was listening to a ghost. She dragged me to the front door, then stopped, her hand frozen on the knob. Her face went pale. She said I have to leave. She corrected herself, her voice trembling. "She needs you to stay. Just for a minute. She has a message for you." And then she was gone. She ran out into the night, abandoning me to a ghost I couldn't see and a danger that was rapidly becoming all too real. The smoke thickened, clawing at my throat. The orange glow began to lick at the edges of the hallway. The sheer animal panic of being alone, of being left behind because of a voice in her mother's head, is a feeling I can't adequately describe. It was a betrayal so deep, it carved itself into my bones. I escaped, obviously. A neighbor heard the smoke alarm and broke down the door. But I didn't escape the memory. I didn't escape the searing knowledge that my own mother chose the word of a phantom over the safety of her child. From that day forward, I vowed to live a life governed by logic, a life she couldn't touch with her irrational fears. I dedicated myself to the tangible, the provable, the historical record. I built my fortress of facts to keep the ghosts out. But I was about to learn that some ghosts don't need a believer to exist. They just need you.
The project that brought it all to the surface was the kind of thing I lived for. A deep dive into the Penhale family, a wealthy and notoriously eccentric dynasty from the late 19th century. I'd been commissioned by the local historical society to create a museum exhibit, and they'd given me full access to the family estate, a crumbling Gothic revival mansion that had been sealed for almost 50 years. It was a historian's dream. Boxes upon boxes of letters, journals, photographs, even clothing and personal effects, all perfectly preserved. I set up a makeshift office in the grand library, A cavernous room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and enormous arched windows that overlooked a landscape of dying gardens. For weeks, I was in heaven. I pieced together lives, uncovered forgotten scandals, and felt the quiet thrill of connecting with the past on an intimate level. It was during this time, buried in the dusty solitude of the Penn Hill Library, that my fortress began to show its first crack. I was working late, as I often did, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the adrenaline of a new discovery. The sun had long set, leaving the sprawling grounds outside in an inky blackness. The only light came from the single lamp on my desk, casting a warm, isolated pool in the immense darkness of the room. The large window to my left, the one that looked out over the skeletal remains of a rose garden, was a sheet of pure black glass, a perfect mirror reflecting the little island of my workspace. I had just found a series of letters from the matriarch, Eleanor Penhale, to her sister, letters filled with a strange, creeping despair. She wrote of a shadow in the nursery, a weeping that has no source, and a profound, unshakable grief over a child she had lost. Her words were so raw, so full of pain, that I felt a genuine pang of sorrow for this woman who had been dead for over a century. I rubbed my tired eyes and leaned back in my chair, stretching my arms over my head. My gaze drifted to my reflection in the dark window. And that's when I saw her. It wasn't a sudden fright. It was a slow, creeping, impossible realization. She was standing right behind my reflection's shoulder. She was just a girl, maybe a young teenager. Her hair was long and black, hanging in damp, stringy curtains around a face that was the color of bleached bone. She wore a simple white dress, old-fashioned, maybe a nightgown, and it was stained. Down the front, from her collar to the hem, was a spray of crimson so vivid it seemed to hum in the dim light. It wasn't a faded, historical stain. It looked wet, fresh, sickeningly bright. But it was her face that stopped my heart. Her mouth was open, stretched in a scream that made no sound. It was an agony so pure and so silent, it was louder than any noise. Her eyes were wide, dark, and utterly vacant, like two black holes drilled into her skull. They weren't looking at my reflection. They were looking through it, past it, directly at me. The air in my lungs turned to ice. My entire life, every principle I had built my identity on, screamed that this was impossible. A trick of the light, an overtired mind playing games, a pareidolia effect in the smudges on the old glass. I had a dozen logical explanations all ready to deploy, my standard operating procedure for anything that smacked of my mother's world. But my body wasn't listening to my brain. A cold dread, and heavier and more real than any document I'd ever held, was seeping into me. It felt ancient and deeply, deeply wrong. Every instinct I had was telling me to run, to flee from this place and never look back. But my historian's mind, the part of me that had been so meticulously trained, was screaming something else. Observe. Document. Do not look away. I didn't move. I couldn't. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but my limbs were locked in place. I stared at the girl in the window, this impossible, silent, screaming thing, and tried to apply logic. I methodically moved my head to the left, just a fraction. Her reflection stayed perfectly in place behind mine. I moved to the right. She remained. A static image of despair tethered to my own likeness. She wasn't a reflection of anything in the room behind me. I knew with absolute certainty that if I turned around, the space would be empty. The horror of that thought was a physical blow. This wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense, a translucent figure floating in the library. This was something else. This was in the reflection. It was part of it. It was part of me. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity. My real self, frozen at a desk in a dusty library, and my reflected self held hostage by a weeping apparition. The silence of the room was immense, broken only by the frantic beat of my own pulse in my ears. The girl in the window never moved, never blinked, her silent scream a perpetual fixture on her pale face. Then, as slowly and inexplicably as it appeared, it changed. She didn't fade away. Instead, my own reflection began to absorb her. The image of the screaming girl wavered like a heat haze and then dissolved into my own likeness in the glass. For a terrifying second, her screaming mouth was superimposed over my own reflected one. Her vacant eyes stared out of my sockets. Then, just like that, it was over. My reflection was normal again. Just me, a tired woman in a dark room, looking pale and terrified. I finally broke my paralysis. I spun around in my chair so fast it nearly toppled over. The library was exactly as it had been. Empty. Silent. Just rows and rows of books, bearing witness to nothing. I slowly, hesitantly, turned back to the window. My reflection was mine, and mine alone. There was no girl, no white dress, no blood, but the image of her was burned on the inside of my eyelids. I knew with a certainty that defied a lifetime of skepticism that I had not imagined it. My fortress had been breached, and something had gotten inside.
I didn't return to the Penhale estate for 3 days. I called the Historical Society and told them I had the flu, a lie that felt flimsy and ridiculous even as I said it. In reality, I was hiding in my own apartment, a sleek, minimalist box on the 27th floor, surrounded by the comforting, logical hum of the city below. My apartment was my sanctuary, the very antithesis of the Penhale mansion's decaying grandeur and my mother's chaotic, incense-choked house. Here, every surface was clean, every object had its place. It was a space I could control. I spent those 3 days in a state of forced normalcy, trying to bury the memory of the girl in the window under a mountain of mundane tasks. I organized my bookshelves, deep-cleaned my kitchen, and tried to lose myself in academic journals. I was performing logic, going through the motions of a rational life, hoping my mind would catch up. I told myself it was a stress-induced hallucination, a waking nightmare brought on by exhaustion and the morbid subject matter of my research. My brain, the organ I trusted above all else, was simply misfiring. On the third night, I was finally starting to believe my own lies. I felt a semblance of calm returning. I made myself a cup of tea, the steam warming my face, and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window that made up the far wall of my living room. The city sprawled below, a breathtaking tapestry of glittering lights. It was beautiful, orderly, and deeply real. I stood there for a long time, just watching the traffic flow like blood cells through the city's arteries, feeling my sanity stitch itself back together. Then, I looked down. Not at the street, but at the reflection of my own living room in the glass. And there she was again. Not behind me this time. She was seated on the floor in the middle of my reflected room, right on my pristine white rug. She was slumped forward, her long, dark hair obscuring her face, forming a ragged curtain around her. The white dress was the same, and the bloodstain, even in the dim reflection, was a visceral slash of crimson. My carefully reconstructed calm shattered into a million pieces. The teacup slipped from my hand, crashing against the hardwood floor and sending scalding liquid and ceramic shards skittering across the boards. My breath hitched in my throat. It wasn't in the old mansion. It wasn't tied to the Penhale family. It was here. It had followed me home. Or perhaps it had been here all along. The cold that washed over me was no longer just dread. It was a profound, soul-deep violation. My fortress hadn't just been breached, it was occupied. For the next week, I lived in a state of quiet, grinding paranoia. I became a creature of denial. I refused to look at the window. I kept my blinds drawn day and night, living in an artificial twilight that did little to soothe my frayed nerves. I stopped my work entirely. The thought of returning to the Penhale estate and its endless mirroring windows was unbearable. My life, once so ordered, so meticulously curated, shrank to the space between my four walls, and even that felt compromised. The apparition in the window remained. I knew it was there, even without looking. I could feel its presence,
a cold spot in the apartment that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It was a weight, a silent, sorrowful pressure against the back of my mind. The few times I accidentally caught a glimpse, in the reflection of my darkened TV screen, in the glossy surface of a picture frame, there she was again, seated, slumped, motionless. This stillness became the focus of my desperate rationalizations. A static image, I told myself. A persistent after-image burned into my retina from the first hallucination. My mind was stuck in a loop. It was a plausible, scientific-sounding explanation, and I clung to it like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood. It was the only thing keeping me from falling apart completely. The point of no return came on a Tuesday. I had run out of coffee, a small domestic crisis that felt monumental. I forced myself to leave the apartment, my shoulders hunched, my eyes fixed on the pavement, terrified of seeing her in a shop window. The trip was a success. I returned to my dimly lit sanctuary, clutching a bag of coffee beans like a sacred relic. As I walked into the living room, I flicked on a lamp. Its light cast a reflection on the dark screen of my laptop, which sat on the coffee table. And I saw it. She had moved. She was no longer slumped over. In the reflection, the girl was now sitting up straight. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and through the curtain of her stringy, dark hair, I could just make out the pale curve of a cheek. She was still seated on my rug, a silent, bloody guest in my home, but she had moved. The change was so subtle, yet it demolished the last pillar of my denial. This was not an after-image. This was not a trick of my mind. An image doesn't move on its own. The world tilted on its axis. The air grew thin. I was not losing my mind. I was being haunted, and the rules of this haunting were changing. That night, sleep was impossible. My carefully constructed world had been dismantled, leaving me exposed and terrified. The logical frameworks I had relied on my entire life were useless against this thing. I finally understood, in a way my 10-year-old self never could, the terror that drove my mother. It wasn't the fear of the unknown, it was the fear of the known, the absolute, chilling certainty that something impossible is real, and that it is aware of you. I decided I couldn't run anymore. I couldn't hide in my own home. I had to face it. It was the historian in me, perhaps, the part that couldn't leave a mystery unsolved, even if the mystery was my own unraveling sanity. With a trembling hand, I walked to the large living room window and pulled the cord for the blinds. They snapped open with a sound that felt as loud as a gunshot in the silent apartment. The city lights flooded in, and the window became a perfect mirror. And there she was, standing. She was in the center of the reflected room, not 10 feet from where I stood. She was fully upright, her posture rigid, her small hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her head was no longer tilted, but faced forward, directly at me. I could see her face clearly for the first time since the library. The silent scream was gone, replaced by an expression of immense, bottomless sorrow. Her vacant eyes seemed to see through me, to a place of pain I couldn't comprehend. The blood on her dress was a horrific, vibrant marring of the pale fabric, an emblem of some terrible ancient violence. We stood there, woman and apparition, separated by a thin sheet of glass, yet inextricably linked. The city hummed on below, oblivious. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. This was it, the second encounter. And this time, I knew, with a terrifying certainty, there would be no looking away, no rationalizing, no escape. The ghost of a person I had never met, a manifestation of a grief I never knew I carried, was standing in my living room, and she was waiting.
Then the impossible happened again. She took a step. Her reflected form, which should have been bound by the laws of optics, lifted one pale bare foot and placed it forward. The movement was slow, deliberate, a horrifying breach of every law of physics. She was walking towards me, towards the glass, closing the distance in our shared reflected world. A primal, wordless terror seized me. My mind, my beautiful, logical mind, simply broke. All the years of building my fortress, all the facts and figures and historical certainties crumbled to dust in the face of those impossible stepping feet. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going, just away. Away from the window, away from her. I scrambled for the front door of my apartment, my hands fumbling with the deadbolt, my breath coming in ragged, panicked stops. The hallway outside my door offered a straight shot to the elevators, to escape, to the real world. I wrenched the door open and stumbled into the hallway, and she was there. Not a reflection. She was standing at the far end of the corridor, bathed in the cold, sterile light of the emergency exit sign. The sight was so fundamentally wrong that my mind refused to process it for a second. She had no physical form. She couldn't leave the reflection, but there she was. As I stared, frozen, she opened her mouth. The silent, sorrowful scream returned, contorting her pale features into a mask of pure agony. It was a soundless vortex of pain that I felt in the marrow of my bones. I took a stumbling step backward, back into my apartment, my last desperate instinct to put a door between us. My heel caught on the edge of a rug and I fell, landing hard on my back. My head swam. I looked up and she was standing over me. The girl. The apparition. She was inside my apartment. Inside my fortress. No glass, no reflection between us. She was just there. The air grew impossibly cold. I looked down, away from her terrifying face, down at her feet. And what I saw shattered the final remnants of my soul. Her feet were not touching the floor. They were hovering an inch above it. And in the polished surface of my own hardwood floor beneath her, I saw a reflection. It was me. My own face, twisted in terror, staring up from the floorboards. I saw my own fear, my own guilt, the memory of the fire, the searing pain of abandonment. It was all there, reflected in the space she occupied. She was a vessel for my own trauma. I looked back up at her face. The silent scream had stopped. And in its place, for the first and last time, the ghost of my twin sister smiled. It was not a smile of joy or peace. It was a smile of arrival, of consummation, a final, horrifying act of reunion. My vision tunneled. The last thing I saw was that terrible, triumphant smile before the world dissolved into blackness. When I awoke, it was to the gentle light of morning filtering through the window I had run from. For a blissful, disoriented moment, I knew nothing. Then it all flooded back. I was lying on the floor of my living room. The front door was still ajar. The teacup was still shattered near the window. Physically, everything was the same. The apartment was silent, holding its breath. But the atmosphere was poisoned. The space was no longer mine. It was a tomb, a memorial to the death of my reason. I sat up slowly, my body aching. I felt hollowed out, a fragile shell. The woman who had built a fortress of facts was gone, buried under the rubble of an impossible truth. I looked at my reflection in the dark television screen. I was pale, my eyes wide and haunted, but I was alone. She was gone. The confrontation was over, but I knew with a certainty that was now the only truth I had left, that she wasn't gone for good. She was just quiet. She was inside me now, a silent passenger, a shared grief. The feeling of abandonment I had harbored for decades had found its twin. The horror wasn't in the haunting, it was in the understanding.
She didn't want to hurt me. She didn't want revenge. She just wanted me to feel what she felt, to never be alone again. And in that, she had succeeded completely.
The weeks that followed are a blur of muted grays. I didn't leave the apartment. I couldn't. Every reflective surface was a potential ambush. The polished chrome of the elevator doors, the windows of the subway, the puddles on the street after it rained, they were all portals now, waiting to show me her sorrowful face. My fortress had become my prison. My life's work, the history I had clung to, felt like a collection of meaningless stories. What were verifiable facts in the face of what I had experienced? My world had been split open, revealing a terrifying, illogical dimension I could no longer deny. Then, one afternoon, the doorbell rang. It was my mother. I hadn't spoken to her in months. She stood in the doorway, her eyes, the same eyes that had once looked at me with such frantic, deluded terror, now filled with a strange, beatific calm. She looked past me, into my apartment, as if seeing someone else. She stepped inside, her hand reaching out, not to me, but to the empty space beside me. "There you are," she whispered, a tear tracing a path through her wrinkled makeup. "I've missed you so much." I just stared at her, my mind too fractured to comprehend. She finally looked at me, but her gaze was distant, unfocused. A soft, pitying smile touched her lips. "Oh, Lena, don't you worry. I'll take care of your sister now." And in that moment, the final horror bloomed in the ruins of my mind. My mother, the woman whose irrationality I had rebelled against my entire life, could now see her too. Or rather, she saw what she had always wanted to see. In her world of whispers and phantoms, her lost child had finally come home. She looked at me, her only living daughter, the one who survived the fire, and saw only a vessel, a companion for the ghost she had mourned for 40 years. I'd been abandoned once in the fire, left for a phantom's message. Now, I was being abandoned again, my identity erased, my existence replaced by the reflection of a sister I never knew. I am her keeper. I am her prison. And in my mother's eyes, I am no longer even myself. The reflection in the window had won. It had taken everything.
The horrors linger. Thank you so much for watching or listening. By liking and subscribing, you're helping me summon the next chilling tale from the shadows. Join our community of the brave and prepare for what's to come.